And welcome back. Now, a judgment has been reserved in the High Court matter between Public Enterprise Minister Pravin Gordhan and Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane. Gordhan has applied for an urgent interdict to suspend remedial action against him. And releasing her report last week, the Public Protector recommended that President Ramaphosa take action against Gordhan for violating the executive member's ethics code and for misleading Parliament. Political analyst Aubrey Matshiqi joins me now to talk about these and other developments. Thanks so much for coming through.
Tawaza, good morning.
Now, first and foremost, you know, there's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of noise. Let's try and wade through all of that and try to understand what is actually going on here. What is at play?
Well, the first question we must answer is, how did we get here? We got here because for too long we lived under the single-party dominance of the ANC, because ours for too long was an uncompetitive electoral system and uncompetitive electoral politics and uncompetitive politics which produced the single-party dominance of the ANC. With single-party dominance, if it comes for too long, certain things will happen. For instance, institutional uncertainty sets in, and the dominant party becomes desensitized to the needs and interests of ordinary citizens. But also there are no consequences for the dominant party when it fails with regard to good governance, when it fails with regard to arresting corruption, and so on, because it cannot lose an election. In other words, in part we got to where we are today because of a lack of substantive uncertainty in South African politics in general and our electoral politics in particular. But what we have today is a situation where battles in the dominant party have infected both the state and society. And to some extent, state institutions and processes have become an extension of internal battles in the ANC, which means outside the ANC, there are interests that have attached to themselves to these internal ANC battles. Part of these interests include capital, for instance. And so, as a result, we have a situation today where you have commissions of inquiry, because of no fault of their own, that have become an extension of two things: the internal ANC battles, and secondly, an extension of the court of public opinion. The court of public opinion has become quite significant because political considerations and political battles override the legal. And that is why I think today we can safely say that politics is the law of the land.
So looking at the notion of state capture, and we know, for example, that former President Jacob Zuma contests this. He does not believe that state capture exists or has taken place. But if we look at how things are unfolding at the moment within the state, and one would say, as you point out, in the ANC and by extension within the state, are we still in the grips of state capture? What exactly is happening there?
Well, for reasons that are at variance with those of the former president, Jacob Zuma, I have never bought into this notion of state capture. Saying so does not mean I do not believe there's a problem with corruption in South Africa, because there is. And in part, that corruption, as I say, is a product of the ANC's single-party dominance, and therefore a product of a lack of substantive uncertainty in our politics. But having said that, what we must appreciate is that by the time Jacob Zuma leaves office, corruption is no longer endemic, but has become systemic. That is the dominant culture in the state and the private sector. Now, the reason why we must worry about corruption is because corruption in the context of single-party dominance, where battles are fought in the dominant party, can be a threat to national peace and stability. So the reason we must fight corruption is not because of the pernicious effect or not only because of the pernicious effect corruption has on the ruling party, but also because of the pernicious effect corruption has on the nation and our society, but also, to some extent, to the extent that corruption may and has compromised our national sovereignty. But another reason I don't buy into this notion of state capture is that this is about framing. Remember that part of a political battle includes a battle for mind share, which is a battle for the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens. So you frame the concept in a particular way. You frame it in a way that advantages your interests. Therefore, you frame it in a self-serving way. But you also frame it in a way that disadvantages your opponents. And therefore, the concept of state capture, in my view, narrow as it is as a concept in how it is applied and deployed, has become a political weapon. Whereas my understanding of state capture, firstly, starts with the fact that the state is always contested. And therefore the state is either always captured or there is what I can call a draw between the forces that are fighting to capture the state, or a stalemate between the forces that are fighting for a control of the state. Where you do not have a stalemate and one of the forces has emerged dominant or victorious, it is not in principle that we oppose state capture. We oppose state capture when those who have captured the state are not people like us, or people who like us, or people we like. But when it is people like us, or people who like us, or people we like, we do not object to state capture. Therefore, a lot of the objections we see and hear in South Africa's political discourse is not in principle.
So looking at one of the phrases that you often use, the one of devils with halos and angels with horns, we see the public getting drawn into this and taking sides almost, as it were, whether it is yesterday in Busisiwe Mkhwebane, the public protector, and Pravin Gordhan. You saw masses gathering outside the State Capture Commission of Inquiry when the former state president appears there. Thandi Modise, the Speaker of Parliament, appearing in court. And then you have Zandile Gumede, the Executive Mayor of Durban. And you can name a whole list of people, high-profile personalities, who go to courts or go to these commissions. And you see people coming out in support of them. What is that about? Does that speak to, our penchant as a nation for backing certain people, certain personalities, or is it more nuanced?
Well, remember, Sakina, that in the first place, Pravin Gordhan, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Busisiwe Mkhwebane end up in court because of politics. So the political battles end up in our courts of law. Secondly, those of us who are ordinary civilians and citizens are far from the action, are far from critical information that influences the content of these battles. And therefore, to some extent, we are victims of Orwellian manipulation. And for citizens, a lot of that Orwellian manipulation takes place in the court of public opinion through the media. And that is why I am not surprised that an increasing number of South Africans is beginning to bemoan the fact that some journalists have become embedded with factions in the ANC. And how this works, how this Orwellian manipulation works, first of all, is to give the wrong impression that news is neutral and innocent. News is valueless. Whereas this thing we call news is socially constructed. And therefore this thing we call news is value-laden. And it is a function of selection. What you select as newsworthy is a function of what you bring to the story, whether in terms of gender, in terms of race, history, culture, and so on. So in part, we fall victim to this Orwellian manipulation for two reasons. One, because news is value-laden, but also because too many of us, when we engage with information and news, we do so to confirm our pre-existing prejudices and bias. And it also does not help that generally in society, a lot of learning that takes place is thoughtless.
But what does that say about us as a nation, as citizens, individual citizens, and a community of citizens and our agency? Are we just being manipulated, be it by the political elite, be it by those in the media who frame certain narratives? What does it say about us and our agency? Have we outsourced that?
Well, I'm glad you're raising that question, because when I talk to my journalist friends about this Orwellian manipulation, they make a very unhelpful and unsophisticated argument. They say to me, no, Aubrey, no one calls me to tell me what to write. And in effect, that indicates to me how deep the Orwellian manipulation is, because it means they are like fish. A fish is not aware that it is in water. And therefore they are like fish. They are not aware that they are in water. And what is the water? Dominant interests, economic and otherwise, globally, must be replicated, must be reproduced. And how do you reproduce them? You reproduce them through dominant narratives. You must create canons of rational opinion, and anything that falls outside those canons of rational opinion must be deemed irrational. But that reproduction takes place in the education system too. Ours is an education system that is not too big when it comes to producing citizens that have a capacity for critical thought. That is not the same as saying people are unintelligent. A lot of intelligent people lack critical thought. And I think our education system does not produce critical thought. And that is why, half jokingly, I have argued that we must close down the education system indefinitely until you know how to create an education system that will foster critical thought. Because in the absence of critical thought, we become easy targets and easy victims of those who want to manipulate our thoughts, who therefore want to manipulate our perception of political, social, economic, and other realities.
So, in the absence of being able to stimulate people, citizens who are capable of critical thought, what are we left with? And by the way, is that by design or by default?
It is partly by design, to the extent that those whose interests are dominant in the global economy and national economies must replicate that order. So some of the battles we see, even in South Africa, are battles about the preservation of that order. But as I said also, a lot of learning, therefore, that happens in society is thoughtless. So what are we left with? We are left with master narratives. But what gives me hope is the fact that while the master narratives are dominant, you are seeing the emergence of counter-narratives, of counter-hegemonic discourses. But we need to reach beyond counter-hegemonic discourses, because when you are part of a counter-narrative, your point of reference is still the master narrative, whereas the ideal is the creation of auto-hegemonic discourses.
Well, I so desperately want to continue, but if I start something now, we're not going to make it in time to get out and onto the other things that we need to get to. So we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for stopping by this morning, Koko Aubrey Matshiqi, and talking to us about where we find ourselves right now as a nation, and what some of these nuances that are playing out actually mean and say about us as a nation. Right, we're going to go to a break. On the other side of that, we'll have your news.